Many of the students who had me at the seminary in their fourth year will know that I was very fond of this book, Kurt Marquart's book, The Church and Her Fellowship, Ministry, and Governance. It's a book chock full of really great teaching about the church and the relationship between the church and the pastor, the pastoral office. Lots of good stuff in here, heavy-duty doctrine. And it's a great example of a little sidebar note that I like to make, that I believe theology is far more interesting and usually far more helpful when it's done by an individual than by committee. Committee theology tends to be rather predictable, often insipid, and not so interesting, whereas theology done by an individual is always idiosyncratic and therefore quite interesting and makes it far more engaging. Marquart is a great example of that. All of his little style and his little pet peeves come through strongly, and it makes it a really engaging read. Now, all that's true, but today I want to focus on one little part of his text on page 203 when Marquart's talking about church polity and how things are supposed to work in the church. And he has here a little paragraph which I have found to be exceedingly insightful and so profoundly important if we would actually take it seriously in how we operate as the church. So here's the paragraph. Those who urge that nothing beyond local congregations can really be a church often do so without adequate theological reflection, simply in order to avoid the spiritual tyranny of a superchurch, whatever that is. This well-meaning argument is badly mistaken, however. Now here's the key part. It is precisely as churches that synods are controlled by faith and love and therefore cannot tyrannize anybody. The more this churchly constitution and its constraints are forgotten and replaced by political notions of majority rule and commercial chains of command, the more scope there is for worldly carnal powers and all its works. This goes to the heart of the question of the nature of church government. That's profound. What Marquart is arguing here is that we need to remember that the church is the church. We need to treat the church like the church, and we need to operate like the church is the church. Now, this seems like a tautology, of course, the church is the church, but we need to think about what this really means. Because if the church is operating like the church, that means we are normed by faith and by love and not by power and authority and command and trying to get our way and trying to assert our rights. That's the way of the world. It's not the way of the church. The way of the church is sacrifice, giving of self for the sake of the other, letting love be the dominant thing, trusting Christ's command and following him in faith. That's the way of the church. It's not the way of the world. And so what Marquart is reminding us is that we need to think about the church at the congregational level, at the district level, at the synodical level, as church and not as a political institution. There is a gross mistake that gets perpetuated in our circles when the church is being described as, well, it's a political institution. And I've even heard the argument being made, and being made rather emphatically, that, well, this is the issue of the two kingdoms. So the church has the spiritual component and a temporal component. And its temporal component, it's a political institution. And so it operates with political rules. And then as the spiritual institution, it operates with spiritual rules. This is exactly what Marquart's warning against. We can't make this weird bifurcation and use the two kingdoms teaching as an excuse for the church to look and act like the world and like worldly institutions. That's junk. And it happens, I think, way too often. We use the excuse that, well, the church is after all a temporal institution, and it has to just function with temporal rules. That's an excuse to look like the world. The church needs to look and act like the church, even when we're doing political things, even when we're carrying out actions which are constitutionally directed or whatever. So what does this mean concretely when I'm arguing that the church needs to look like the church? What I'm getting at is that we need to be consistent in how we operate. We are always Christ's church in the world, whether at the congregational level, the district level, a seminary institution, or the synodical level. We are the church, and we need to look and act and witness like we are the church, and not sort of pick which one we want to do whenever it's convenient. Oh, now we'll act like the world, and we'll play by the world's rules because we're doing a worldly thing, and now the church can have an excuse to just be playing the game of the world. And then other times now we're going to be the church and play the church spiritual reality card, and we kind of play it both ways. That's not the way to operate with the two kingdoms. That's not what we're thinking about here at all. The church is Christ's reality at work in the world. We need to look like it. So, when does this get violated? I think it gets violated in conventions a lot. When we start thinking that Robert's rules are the supreme order of the day over against even biblical injunctions. And maybe a corollary of this is when you have synodical institution leaders, or when you have people just functioning within the church, whatever synod you're in, and it's the bylaws of the synod in the Constitution or in the bylaws that become the norm of how we operate, rather than clear words from God's own scriptures. And this happens sometimes. I've actually heard an individual tell me once that, yeah, I probably should talk to my brother about this problem we've got over something, but the bylaws forbid it because of our rules. That's nonsense. That's absolute nonsense, that the bylaws would take precedence over scriptural direction, but it happens. And see, this is an example of the world creeping in and directing how we operate in the church instead of operating like the church. Or it happens when we have the church invoking its right to use the courts to secure its rights for the sake of its rights. And that's the world talking again. The church doesn't do that. The church is not interested in securing her rights, fighting for her place, getting her fair share. The church doesn't do that. That's why St. Paul gives us clear admonition in 2 Corinthians that we don't sue each other. We don't run off to the courts to solve things because we're the church. We operate in a different way. We operate in a different attitude towards each other. We have a different set of rules that guide us in the church. It also means that we don't always just simply try to figure out how we can get our way by getting the most votes. The majority does not rule in the church. And this is a classic example of us looking more like Americans than like Christians, when we think that somehow democracy is God's chosen way, and if the majority has decided, well, then that's God's will. It's nonsense. The majority does not decide anything. This is very clear on doctrine, but it also comes into play when it comes to adiaphora. We need to be careful of operating with the notion that somehow, well, the majority has voted, therefore they have the right to exercise their authority and get what they want to have done. The majority doesn't run things, Christ does. And if Christ is running things, that means faith and love are the dominant things. Now, Marquart reminds us of this wonderful section in Pieper's Dogmatics. And I'm going to go right to Pieper on this one. And this is in Volume 3 of Pieper's Dogmatics. And Pieper, of course, is the standard of this is what theology looks like when you're doing it hardcore, faithfully well. And yet it's chock full of all these concrete little practical things that Pieper is so fond of giving us. So in Volume 3 on page 430, he writes this about church voting. And this is the very end of his discussion about the church and about the church's polity. And he's almost to the end, getting ready to shift gears and move into the office of the ministry. And he's offering some concrete kind of direction here. And he says this: in adiaphora, in other words, if it's not an issue of doctrine settled in Scripture and by the church's teaching, but in adiaphora, which is anything not doctrinal, which is most of what we probably talk about when it comes to church discussions at voters' meetings and at church council meetings and at synodical and district conventions. In adiaphora, a vote is taken to ascertain what the majority regards as the best. The natural order is that in adiaphora, the minority yields to the majority and acquiesces, not because the majority has the right to rule, but for love's sake. If we're trying to figure something out, and most people seem to want this, it would make sense to say, all right, the minority should say, well, if most of you want this, in love, we'll yield to you, let's go ahead and do that. It kind of makes sense. Not because they have an inherent right, because they're the majority. That's democratic thinking. That's American thinking. No, it's just a way to kind of settle things that makes sense, kind of helps most people. We'll go with what most people want. But then Pieper continues this. Since, however, love is queen here, it may happen that the majority will yield to the minority. Wow! The majority would yield to the minority. Why? When would that happen? Well, what would happen when the majority recognizes that although they might have the most votes, this minority group with their opinion is so strong in their opinion that it would actually fracture the love they have, or maybe even cause a division within the church. There's a compelling argument here that sometimes, for the sake of unity, the majority needs to yield to the minority. And you might say, well, then that's the minority just kind of playing their little baby card and having their way because they make a tantrum. Well, maybe. But that's still the majority's responsibility to say, what are we doing to foster unity and love here, and not just saying we've got the most votes, therefore we win. It doesn't work that way in the church. In the church, we ask the question, what is fostering love? What is bringing unity? And for the sake of unity and love, sometimes we make sacrifices, and sometimes the majority even yields to the minority for the sake of love and unity. So, in this season of conventions, which happens every 3 years in our church body on a regular basis, district level and then synodical level, maybe we should be asking the question a little more carefully. What does love dictate us to do, instead of just who's got the votes, who's got the right procedure, who knows how to play the game, the shrewdest and the smartest to get things done the way they want them done? It's adiaphora, people. We're just talking about preferences and ways of doing things. Doctrine is clear-cut. Scripture's told us what we do. The church's teaching is there. In issues of adiaphora, we need to be thinking more about what's the loving thing to do here? What's going to give for the sake of unity, to bring unity and fullness and love to us and how we operate together. And sometimes maybe the majority needs to say, what do we need to do to help bring this minority group back into full fellowship with us and back into a stronger sense of union that we have, instead of just saying, well, look, we got the votes, we won, you guys have to deal with it. That's not how the church operates. It's not how we should operate. Let's act like the church. And let's heed the admonition that the church needs to be the church in how she operates all the time, in every situation, always witnessing the reality of Christ and His love and His ways of operating.